The dense fog clung to the ground, curling around the tires of the Jeep as it bumped along the narrow, unpaved road. Dr. Emily Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes scanning the map on the dashboard. According to the coordinates, she was nearing her destination, a remote, nearly forgotten swamp nestled deep within the Louisiana bayou. The locals called it Danvers Swamp, and its reputation was as murky as its waters. Emily had heard the stories, of course, whispers of creatures that lurked in the shadows, unseen but always present. Swamp beasts, they called them. But she was a scientist, a biologist with years of fieldwork under her belt. Ghost stories and local superstitions had no place in her world. She was here for one reason: to study a unique species of plant that glowed in the dark, a phenomenon that had captured her interest and drawn her to this isolated corner of the earth. The Jeep jolted as it hit another pothole, jarring her from her thoughts. Emily glanced at her watch. It was getting late. She needed to find a suitable spot to set up camp before nightfall. The dense canopy of cypress trees above blocked out most of the fading daylight, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. She pressed on, determined to reach the clearing she had marked on her map. After another half-hour of driving, the trees began to thin, and the road widened into a small, overgrown clearing. Emily brought the Jeep to a stop and cut the engine, the sudden silence enveloping her like a heavy blanket. She stepped out, stretching her stiff limbs, and took a deep breath. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. The swamp was alive with sound, chirping crickets, the distant croak of a bullfrog, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the underbrush. Emily walked to the edge of the clearing, peering into the dense foliage. The swamp beckoned her with its mystery, and despite the oppressive atmosphere, she felt a thrill of anticipation. She was on the brink of discovery, about to unravel the secrets of a plant that had eluded scientists for decades. She unloaded her gear from the Jeep, tents, equipment, notebooks, and cameras, and began setting up her camp. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, one that crept up on her unexpectedly, sending a shiver down her spine. But she dismissed it, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings and the eerie tales she had heard along the way. The last of the daylight faded as she finished setting up her tent. The swamp, now shrouded in darkness, seemed to close in around her. She clicked on her headlamp, the beam cutting through the blackness, and checked her supplies one last time. Satisfied that everything was in order, she settled into her tent, eager to review the notes she had already compiled on Luminosa virilis. But as she opened her notebook, a sound outside made her pause. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of insects, but it was there, heavy breathing accompanied by a soft splash in the water. Emily froze, listening intently. The sound came again, this time closer, more distinct. It was followed by the slow, deliberate movement of something dragging through the water. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly unzipped the tent and peered out into the night. The beam of her headlamp flickered as she scanned the area, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the dark, impenetrable swamp. The breathing had stopped, and all that remained was the distant croak of a frog. She exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Probably just a gator, she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. But as she zipped the tent back up and settled into her sleeping bag, the unease remained. The swamp was a living, breathing entity, and she was a stranger in its midst. Despite her efforts to focus on her research, sleep eluded her. Every rustle, every splash, and every distant call seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Emily's thoughts wandered to the locals she had met earlier that day, their warnings about the swamp beasts, the way their eyes had darted nervously as they spoke. She had laughed it off at the time, but now, alone in the heart of the swamp, the stories seemed less far-fetched. What if there was something out there, something that had yet to be documented by science? The thought both excited and terrified her. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and Emily drifted off into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures moving through the water, their glowing eyes watching her from the darkness. Morning came with the first rays of sunlight piercing through the canopy. Emily woke up with a start, the remnants of her unsettling dreams still clinging to her mind. She shook them off and unzipped her tent, ready to face the day. But as she stepped outside, her heart skipped a beat. The ground around her camp was covered in strange, webbed footprints, large, too large to belong to any animal she knew. The tracks circled her tent, leading into the swamp and disappearing into the water. Her mind raced as she crouched down to examine them, every instinct telling her that these were no ordinary animal tracks. Suddenly, the reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was alone, miles away from civilization, in a place where the boundaries between myth and reality were blurred. The swamp had secrets, and whatever had made those tracks was one of them. Emily stood up, her eyes scanning the tree line. She was no longer just a scientist on a research expedition. She was a trespasser in a world that was not her own. The thrill of discovery had given way to something darker, something far more dangerous. As the swamp hummed with life around her, Emily realized she was in the heart of the unknown, and whatever was out there, it knew she was here. The morning sun filtered weakly through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the damp ground. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves, and the swamp around her seemed to have awakened with a renewed intensity. Dr. Emily Carter knelt beside one of the large webbed footprints that surrounded her camp, tracing its outline with a trembling finger. She had seen many strange things during her years of fieldwork, but nothing like this. The prints were enormous, each easily twice the size of her hand, with deep indentations that suggested a creature of significant weight. The webbing between the toes was clear and distinct, hinting at an amphibious nature. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to reconcile the evidence before her with the knowledge she had brought with her into the swamp. A rational part of her mind tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was just a large alligator, or maybe some other swamp-dwelling creature she hadn't yet encountered. But as she followed the trail of prints leading into the murky water, she knew deep down that this was something else, something unknown to science. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for any other signs of movement or disturbance. The swamp was still, but the silence felt oppressive, as though the very air around her was holding its breath. She could sense it again, that nagging feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking her every move. Emily straightened up, brushing the dirt off her hands, and forced herself to think logically. She was a scientist, after all, and her job was to document and analyze, not to jump to conclusions. She retrieved her camera from her pack and began taking photos of the footprints, making sure to capture every angle, every detail. Whatever had made these prints, she would figure it out, one way or another. As she moved around the camp, snapping photos, her mind raced with possibilities. The swamp was a place of ancient mysteries, a perfect breeding ground for undiscovered species. But the sheer size of the prints, coupled with the unsettling sounds she had heard the night before, filled her with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Emily packed up her camera and returned to her tent, where she spread out her notes and began scribbling down her observations. The logical part of her mind kept trying to assert itself, urging her to remain objective, to approach this as she would any other discovery. But the fear gnawing at the edges of her thoughts refused to be silenced. She glanced at her map, which she had carefully marked with the locations of the glowing plants she had come to study. The plants, Luminosa virelis, were scattered across the swamp, their luminescence growing stronger as night fell. If there was a connection between the plants and the creature that had left those footprints, she needed to find it. And that meant venturing deeper into the swamp, where the plants were most concentrated and where the creature might be hiding. Emily steeled herself for the day ahead. She packed a small bag with essentials, water, a notebook, her camera, and a machete, and slung it over her shoulder. Her GPS was clipped to her belt, a reassuring piece of technology in a place that seemed to defy modern navigation. She took a deep breath and headed toward the water's edge, following the faint trail of glowing plants that led deeper into the swamp. As she waded through the knee-deep water, the mud sucking at her boots with each step, she couldn't help but feel the swamp closing in around her. The thick canopy above allowed only slivers of sunlight to penetrate, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. The calls of birds and the occasional splash of a fish were the only sounds that broke the silence. She found the first cluster of glowing plants about a mile from her camp. They were beautiful, even in daylight, their faint glow a testament to the unique conditions of the swamp. Emily knelt beside one, examining its structure closely. The plant's leaves were broad and waxy, with veins that pulsed with a soft green light. The roots seemed to extend deep into the muddy ground, drawing nutrients from the rich soil. She began to document the plant, carefully noting its characteristics, when she heard a sound that made her freeze, a low, guttural growl, unmistakable and far too close. Her heart leapt into her throat as she slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. At first, she saw nothing, but then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, she caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape slipping silently through the trees, too large to be a deer or any other common animal. She felt her blood run cold as she realized the shape was following her, keeping just out of sight. Emily's mind raced. The creature, whatever it was clearly aware of her presence, and it was intelligent enough to avoid being seen. Her hands shook as she packed up her notes and camera, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. She needed to get back to her camp, back to safety, before the creature decided to close the distance between them. She moved slowly at first, not wanting to draw attention, but as she reached the water's edge, her sense of urgency took over. She quickened her pace, the water splashing around her legs as she pushed through the swamp. The sounds behind her grew louder. Heavy footsteps, the rustling of leaves, and that same unsettling growl, now more insistent. Panic began to rise in her chest as she realized the creature was no longer hiding, it was coming for her. She broke into a run, the mud sucking at her boots, the trees blurring past as she made a desperate dash for her camp. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to keep moving, to focus on the path ahead. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled into the clearing where her camp was set up. She didn't stop, didn't dare look back, until she reached the safety of her tent. She collapsed to her knees, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. For a moment, she couldn't think, couldn't do anything but listen to the deafening silence that had settled over the swamp. But then, slowly, she began to process what had just happened. The creature, whatever it was, had followed her all the way back to camp, but it hadn't attacked. It had stopped just short of the clearing, as if it were waiting, watching. Emily knew she was no longer just an observer in this place. She was part of the swamp's ecosystem, a player in a game she didn't fully understand. And the creature, with its glowing eyes and webbed feet, was not going to let her leave without a fight. As the shadows lengthened and the swamp was once again shrouded in darkness, Emily sat in her tent, her hands shaking as she reviewed the photos she had taken that morning. The footprints, the glowing plants, and the shadowy figure in the trees. They were all pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to unravel. But one thing was certain. The swamp beasts were real, and they were far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The fear that had gnawed at her since her arrival was no longer an abstract feeling. It was a living, breathing entity that stalked her through the night. And as she sat there, alone in the heart of the swamp, Emily realized that the legends she had once dismissed as superstition were far closer to the truth than she had ever wanted to believe. The swamp had taken on a different character as night fell. The air, already thick with humidity, seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on Dr. Emily Carter as she sat in her tent, her senses on high alert. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. The strange, webbed footprints, the ominous growl, and the shadowy figure that had followed her back to camp. She knew now that the swamp beasts were not just legend, and the realization brought with it a cold, creeping dread that she couldn't shake. Emily had always prided herself on her rationality, her ability to remain calm and analytical even in the face of the unknown. But as the night deepened and the swamp around her seemed to close in, she felt that resolve slipping away. She had ventured into this place seeking discovery, but now it was clear that the swamp had other plans for her. Determined to document what she could, she set up her equipment as methodically as her trembling hands would allow. Motion sensors, night vision cameras, and audio recorders were positioned around the perimeter of her camp, all designed to capture any movement or sound. If the creatures came close again, she would be ready, not just to defend herself, but to gather the evidence she needed to prove their existence. As she worked, the swamp seemed to grow quieter, as if it were holding its breath. The usual chorus of frogs and insects had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Every rustle of leaves, every distant splash in the water set her nerves on edge. The sense of being watched was palpable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. With her preparations complete, Emily retreated to the safety of her tent, pulling the flap closed behind her. She checked her equipment one last time, making sure everything was in place, and then sat back, trying to steady her breathing. The tent felt small and fragile, a flimsy barrier against the dangers lurking outside. Hours passed, marked only by the steady ticking of her watch and the occasional rustle of leaves. Her eyes were glued to the monitors, watching for any sign of movement. The darkness outside was impenetrable, broken only by the faint, eerie glow of the Luminosa virilis, plants that dotted the swamp. Their light, once a source of fascination, now seemed almost sinister, casting strange shadows that danced at the edges of her vision. Then, just after midnight, the motion sensors beeped softly, a warning that something was near. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she checked the monitors. At first, she saw nothing, just the same dark, murky swamp. But then, as she adjusted the night vision feed, she saw it. A figure, tall and humanoid, slipping silently through the trees. The creature moved with a grace that belied its size, its glowing eyes scanning the area as it crept closer. Emily's breath caught in her chest as she watched it approach one of the glowing plants. The creature seemed to pause, its hand, webbed and clawed, hovering over the plant as if it were drawing some kind of energy from it. Her camera captured every detail, from the slick greenish skin that glistened in the night to the way its eyes flickered with an unnatural light. The creature was both alien and terrifyingly familiar, like something dredged up from the deepest recesses of the human psyche. Emily forced herself to remain still, even as the creature moved closer to her camp. She could hear it now, heavy breathing, the faint sound of its claws scraping against the earth. It circled her tent, pausing at intervals as if testing her defenses. The sensors continued to beep softly, tracking its every move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and slipped back into the darkness. Emily exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath. She checked the monitors again, but the creature had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest ripple in the water. For a moment, she considered packing up and leaving the swamp altogether, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She was here for a reason, and now she had the evidence she needed. The swamp beasts were real, and she was determined to learn everything she could about them. But even as she tried to steel herself for what lay ahead, a nagging thought gnawed at the edges of her mind. The creature had been studying her, just as she had been studying it. This was not a chance encounter, it was a hunt, and she was the prey. The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. Emily continued her research, documenting the glowing plants and gathering as much information as she could. But the creatures were always there, lurking just out of sight. They never showed themselves during the day, but at night she could feel them moving through the swamp, their presence as tangible as the humid air. Her nights were filled with the sounds of their approach, the heavy footsteps, the splashes in the water, the low growls that sent chills down her spine. Each time they would come closer, testing her defenses, probing for weaknesses. And each time they would retreat just before dawn, leaving her exhausted and on edge. She began to notice patterns in their behavior, subtle cues that hinted at their intelligence. They were not mindless beasts. They were calculating, strategic. They seemed to understand her actions, anticipating her moves before she made them. The more she observed, the more she realized that she was dealing with something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut one night as she reviewed the footage from her cameras. The creatures were using the swamp's dense vegetation and murky waters to their advantage, blending seamlessly into their surroundings. They were stalking her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Panic set in as she realized how outmatched she was. The swamp, once a place of scientific curiosity, had become a deadly game of survival. She was no longer in control. She was being hunted. But Emily was nothing if not resourceful. Her fear gave way to determination as she began to devise a plan. She couldn't leave the swamp without first understanding these creatures, but she also couldn't allow herself to be caught off guard. She needed to outsmart them, to use their own tactics against them. Her mind raced as she recalled the properties of the glowing plants. They seemed to be a crucial part of the creature's ecosystem, providing not just camouflage, but sustenance. If she could disrupt that connection, she might have a chance. She spent the next day gathering as many of the glowing plants as she could find, carefully uprooting them and bringing them back to her camp. She arranged them in a wide circle around the perimeter, creating a bright, glowing barrier. It was a risky move. The creatures might see it as a threat, but it was the only advantage she had. As night fell, Emily prepared herself for what she knew would be the final confrontation. She armed herself with a flare gun, a machete, and a makeshift torch, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. And then, just as she had expected, they came. One by one, the creatures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on the plants. They moved slowly at first, cautiously, as if trying to understand her strategy. But as they drew closer, their movements became more aggressive, more determined. Emily held her breath, her fingers gripping the flare gun as she waited for the right moment. The creatures were within the circle now, their eyes glowing brighter as they neared the plants. She could hear their breathing, their low growls vibrating through the air. In a sudden, explosive movement, Emily fired the flare gun directly at the largest of the creatures. The bright, searing light cut through the darkness, striking the creature in the chest. It let out a deafening roar, its body writhing in pain as the flare ignited the plants around it. The swamp erupted in flames, the glow of the plants intensifying as they burned. The creatures screamed in agony, their glowing eyes flickering as they thrashed wildly, trying to escape the inferno. Emily watched in horror and awe as the flames consumed them, their bodies collapsing into the mud. The fire spread quickly, the heat intense as it raced through the swamp. Emily barely had time to gather her things before she was forced to flee, the flames licking at her heels as she ran. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the swamp, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with exhaustion. She turned back to see the swamp ablaze, the creature's roars growing fainter as the fire consumed everything in its path. The sight was both terrifying and exhilarating, a victory won at a terrible cost. The flames from the previous night had smoldered into a ghostly fog that now hung low over the swamp, turning the once vibrant green landscape into a gray, ashen wasteland. The acrid smell of burnt vegetation clung to the air, mixing with the usual swamp odors to create an atmosphere of decay and death. Dr. Emily Carter sat at the edge of her makeshift camp, her eyes fixed on the distance where the smoke still curled upward, her mind replaying the events that had unfolded just hours before. She had survived, barely. The swamp beasts, those nightmarish creatures that had stalked her relentlessly, were either dead or driven away by the fire. But survival came with a heavy price. Her research equipment was gone, destroyed in the inferno she had unleashed, and the notes she had meticulously recorded were now little more than ash. Everything she had come here to achieve had been reduced to nothing in a single night of terror. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, another emotion pushed its way to the forefront: determination. She was still alive, and as long as she drew breath, she would not give up. The swamp had revealed its dangers, but it had also shown her its secrets. The glowing plants, the connection between the beasts and their environment. It was all part of a puzzle that she was now more determined than ever to solve. But to do that, she would need to outthink and outmaneuver the creatures that had nearly claimed her life. Emily knew she couldn't stay at her current location. It was too exposed, too close to where the beasts had made their attacks. She needed to move, to find a safer place where she could regroup and come up with a plan. As she packed what little remained of her gear, some water, a few rations, her GPS, and her machete, she considered her options. The swamp was vast, and she had only explored a small part of it. Somewhere out there, beyond the charred remains of the night's battle, lay the answers she sought. The creatures were territorial, that much was clear, but they were also highly intelligent. They had used the swamp to their advantage, blending in with the environment, using the dense vegetation and murky waters to stalk her. To survive, she would need to do the same. She recalled the druidic symbols she had seen etched into the bark of some of the larger trees, a remnant of ancient practices, perhaps. But they suggested that there were places in the swamp that held more than just natural power. Places that might offer protection or even clues to the creature's origins. If she could find one of these locations, she might be able to turn the tables on her hunters. With a deep breath, Emily set off into the swamp, moving cautiously through the dense foliage. Every step was deliberate, every sound analyzed. She kept her senses sharp, listening for the telltale signs of the creature's approach. The splash of water, the rustle of leaves, the low growl that had haunted her since her arrival. As she moved deeper into the swamp, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller and thicker, their roots tangled together in a complex network that made progress slow and treacherous. The air was cooler here, the light dimmer, as though the sun itself struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. But Emily pressed on, driven by the need to find a place where she could rest and think without fear of immediate attack. After several hours of navigating the twisted paths and murky waters, she found what she was looking for: a small, elevated clearing surrounded by a natural barrier of thick, gnarled trees. It was an ideal spot, offering both visibility and protection. The ground was dry, a rarity in the swamp, and there was a fresh water source nearby, fed by an underground spring. Emily set up her new camp quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the lingering fear that gnawed at her. She knew she had little time before the creatures would track her down again. The beasts had a keen sense of smell, and they were relentless hunters. But she also knew that she had an advantage. They were drawn to the glowing plants, and she had learned how to use that against them. As night fell once again, Emily set her plan into motion. She had gathered several of the glowing plants along her journey, carefully uprooting them and carrying them in a makeshift satchel. Now she arranged them in a pattern around the perimeter of her camp, creating a circle of light that flickered and pulsed in the darkness. The plants were more than just a source of illumination. They were a lure, a trap designed to draw the beasts in. But Emily knew that simply attracting the creatures wasn't enough. She needed a way to defend herself, to turn the trap into a weapon. The night before, she had noticed that the beasts were sensitive to light and fire, reacting violently when exposed to it. This time, she would use that knowledge to her advantage. She set up a series of rudimentary traps around the glowing plants, makeshift tripwires connected to flares, small bundles of flammable materials ready to ignite at the slightest touch. It was a crude setup, but it was all she had. The real key to her survival would be timing. She needed to lure the creatures close enough to be caught in the blaze, but not so close that they could overwhelm her before she could act. With her preparations complete, Emily settled into a defensive position, her flare gun within easy reach, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. The swamp was alive with sounds, the distant croak of frogs, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional splash of water. But beneath it all, she could sense something else, something more deliberate and menacing. The first sign came just after midnight, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her. Emily's heart raced as she tightened her grip on the flare gun, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps splashing through the water as they approached her camp. The beasts were here. Emily held her breath, forcing herself to remain still as the creatures drew closer. She could see their eyes now, glowing eerily in the darkness, reflecting the light of the plants. There were 3 of them, moving slowly and cautiously, their bodies blending almost seamlessly with the shadows. They were testing her defenses, probing for weaknesses, just as they had done before. But this time, Emily was ready. She waited until the first of the creatures stepped into the circle of light, its massive, webbed feet crushing the plants beneath it. The creature let out a snarl as the light intensified, its eyes narrowing in anger. It moved closer, drawn irresistibly toward the center of the clearing, where Emily waited. When the second beast entered the circle, Emily sprang into action. She pulled the trigger of the flare gun, sending a bright, burning light into the sky. The flare arced overhead, illuminating the entire swamp in a brilliant flash of red. The creatures recoiled, their snarls turning into roars of pain and fury as the light seared their sensitive eyes. Emily didn't hesitate. She triggered the tripwires, igniting the flammable materials she had set up earlier. The clearing erupted in flames, a wall of fire that surrounded the creatures, cutting off their escape. The beasts thrashed wildly, their roars echoing through the swamp as they tried to break free. But Emily knew she couldn't rely on the fire alone. The creatures were strong, and it wouldn't take them long to find a way out. She needed to finish this, now. With a determined shout, she charged forward, her machete in hand. The beasts were disoriented, blinded by the light and the flames, and she took full advantage. She slashed at the nearest creature, the blade slicing through its tough, slimy skin. It let out a pained howl, staggering backward as blood oozed from the wound. The second creature lunged at her, its claws swiping through the air just inches from her face. Emily ducked, rolling to the side and coming up behind it. She drove the machete into its side, twisting the blade as the creature screeched in agony. The flames danced around them, casting everything in a hellish glow. But the third creature was the largest, and it had recovered from the initial shock. It charged at her with terrifying speed, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Emily barely had time to react as it tackled her to the ground, its weight crushing her beneath it. She gasped for breath, the stench of the creature's breath filling her nostrils as it snapped its jaws just inches from her face. Desperation fueled her as she struggled against the creature's grip. She reached for the flare gun, which had been knocked from her hand in the struggle, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. With a final desperate effort, she grabbed it and fired directly into the creature's chest. The flare exploded on impact, engulfing the beast in flames. It roared in agony, releasing her as it thrashed wildly, trying to extinguish the fire. Emily rolled away, gasping for breath as she watched the creature collapse into the flames. The other two were already down, their bodies burning as the fire consumed them. The flames had died down, leaving behind a charred, smoking wasteland where the heart of the swamp once thrived. Dr. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the devastation, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The acrid scent of burnt vegetation clung to her clothes, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and sweat. The air was heavy with silence, the once vibrant sounds of the swamp. Croaking frogs, rustling leaves, the distant call of birds, all but extinguished. Emily's body ached with exhaustion, her muscles trembling from the effort it had taken to survive. The creatures, the swamp beasts, were gone, their bodies reduced to smoldering heaps among the ruins of the plants that had once illuminated the darkness. She had won, but it was a victory that tasted bitter on her tongue. She wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, smearing soot and grime across her skin. Her mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions, relief, fear, grief, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. The swamp had taken so much from her, her equipment, her research, her sense of safety. But it had also given her something she hadn't expected, a profound respect for the raw, untamed power of nature and the knowledge that some mysteries were better left unsolved. She had come here seeking discovery, hoping to bring back something new, something that would cement her place in the scientific community. Instead, she had uncovered a horror that had almost cost her life. But she was alive, and that, she reminded herself, was something. Emily took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. She needed to leave this place to find her way back to civilization. The thought of the journey ahead filled her with dread, but she knew she couldn't stay. The swamp, even in its ruined state, still felt alive, watchful, as though it were waiting for her to make her move. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she navigated the treacherous landscape, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. Her thoughts drifted, unmoored by the sheer exhaustion that gripped her. She thought of her colleagues, of the life she had left behind in the city, of the dreams that had brought her to this godforsaken place. She had wanted so much, to discover, to explore, to understand. But the swamp had other plans. The sun was beginning to set by the time she reached the edge of the swamp, the sky above streaked with hues of orange and pink. The sight of the fading daylight filled her with a bittersweet longing. She had survived another night, but what would the next one bring? The swamp's secrets were not hers to keep, and she knew that despite the destruction she had wrought, the creatures that had hunted her were not the only ones out there. The swamp was vast, ancient, and full of life, some of it beyond her comprehension. The narrow path leading out of the swamp was overgrown and treacherous, but Emily pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line that marked the end of this nightmare. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The fear that had driven her to survive now urged her to leave, to put as much distance between herself and the swamp as possible. As she stumbled out of the swamp and into the open, she felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension in her body releasing in a shuddering breath. She was free. Emily fell to her knees on the solid ground, her body shaking with sobs she couldn't suppress any longer. She had fought so hard to maintain her composure, to stay strong in the face of terror, but now, away from the immediate threat, the enormity of what she had survived hit her with full force. For a long time, she stayed there, letting the emotions she had kept, bottled up, finally spill out. When the tears subsided, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, feeling a strange sense of clarity amidst the lingering fear. She had come to this place seeking knowledge, and in a way she had found it. But it was not the kind of knowledge she could share with the world, at least not in the way she had hoped. She knew that no one would believe her story, that the world beyond this swamp would dismiss her experiences as the fevered delusions of a scientist who had spent too long in isolation. And maybe, she thought with a sad smile, that was for the best. The swamp was a place of ancient power, and it had secrets that were meant to remain hidden. With trembling hands, Emily took out her notebook, one of the few items that had survived the fire. She flipped through the charred pages, her eyes skimming over the notes she had made on the glowing plants, the sketches of the footprints, the hastily scrawled descriptions of the creatures. It all felt so distant now, like something from another life. She tore out the pages one by one and let them scatter in the wind. They fluttered away, disappearing into the trees, taking with them the last remnants of her research. It was a symbolic act, a way of letting go of the obsession that had brought her to the brink of destruction. Emily stood up, her body weak but her mind clearer than it had been in days. She had survived, and now she would leave, carrying with her the knowledge that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, that some places were better left untouched. As she walked away from the swamp, the sounds of the night began to return. The distant call of a bird, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was as if the swamp was reclaiming its place in the world, erasing the scars of the battle that had been fought within its depths. But Emily knew that the swamp would never truly let her go. The memories of the swamp beasts, of the glowing plants, of the nightmarish struggle for survival, would stay with her, haunting her dreams and coloring her perception of the world. She had escaped with her life, but she would never be the same. As she reached the main road where her jeep awaited her, Emily turned one last time to look back at the swamp. The fog had thickened, obscuring the view, but she could still feel the presence of the swamp, watching her, waiting. A part of her wanted to go back, to explore the depths she had not yet touched, to uncover the secrets that still lay hidden. But she knew better now. With a final lingering glance, she turned away and climbed into her Jeep. The engine roared to life, and as she drove away, the swamp receded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Emily Carter had survived the swamp beasts, but the scars they had left, both physical and emotional, would never truly heal. The swamp had taken her to the edge of fear, shown her the limits of her strength, and revealed the darkness that lay within. But in the end, it had let her go, allowing her to return to the world with a new understanding of the fragile boundary between the known and the unknown. The swamp beasts were real, but they belonged to the swamp, and the swamp would keep its secrets forever. And with that, Emily Carter drove into the night, the swamp fading into the darkness, a place of mystery and terror that she would never visit again. The road ahead was long, and the night was dark, but Emily Carter was moving forward, leaving the swamp behind. And in the end, that was all that mattered.